Before we start today's interview, please allow me a word or two about our podcast. Even as Myanmar plunges into a civil war because of the military's bloody coup, the international community and media organizations have all but turned their backs on the country and its people. But this humble platform is committed to staying the course. We conduct nuanced, long-form interviews with a variety of guests connected to Myanmar so our listeners can better understand the ongoing crisis. Thank you for choosing to spend the next couple of hours with us today.
And welcome back. The ongoing crisis in Myanmar has many unsung dimensions to it, things that we might not even think that we're not even thinking about. And yet, the impacts of this coup and the impacts of the ongoing violence on the economy, the people, and in today's case, the environment, need to be addressed and they need to be understood. My guest today is going to be discussing specifically the interplay between conflict and environmental factors within the Myanmar context. And I think this is a topic that has completely flown under the radar for most people. But fortunately, they've published an article about it, which will be linked below this. So I strongly encourage anybody who is interested in the topic to go read it. But for now, Enze, I'd like to thank you for coming on, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself for our audience and tell them a little bit about who you are and what you do.
All right. Thank you for the invitation to come to talk about our research. So my name is Enze Han, and I'm a associate professor at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at University of Hong Kong. The research that we have published in the link that you have already mentioned discussed the relationship between rugged terrain and forest coverage and insurgency in Myanmar. So specifically in the Myanmar context, our finding mainly is that conflict between insurgents and the Myanmar government military most likely to occur in the middle level of forest coverage. So rather they happen. So instead of conflict occurs at extremely low or very high density of forest, but rather they actually most likely to occur in the medium to somewhat high forest densities locations. So what does that mean? It means that there is a very strategic consideration when rebels and government militaries engage in militarized conflict with each other. So particularly this reflect on the reasons that usually it is rebel groups that consider forests for refuge and tactical advantages that give the refuge to give rebel groups because usually there is this asymmetrical military power relations, right? In the sense that rebel groups tend to be less equipped and less numbered. So in some ways, forest coverage provide this shelter effect for rebel groups to seek shelter, as well as reduce the military advantages for the better equipped government militaries. However, we also but this is generally the conventional wisdom. But then our results also indicate that usually it's not like more denser the forest is, and more conflict. So, but in some ways, when the forest coverage become too dense, then the likelihood for conflict also decreases. So in some ways, what our results indicate that is this kind of inverted U-shaped relationship between conflict and forest coverage.
And so this is a departure from the previous understanding. Is what I'm getting, that
yes.
Looking at the Myanmar context, most of the resistance groups historically have found themselves in areas that have very dense forest coverage and or are very mountainous and very rugged. So we would presume that that's where the conflict is happening. But you're telling us that, contrary to the logical conclusion, it is not actually in the ethnic minority heartlands where the majority of clashes are occurring.
So basically, essentially, we argue, we point out that conflict tend to occur. I mean, historically, that is the case, right? Usually, conflict occurs in the ethnic regions within Myanmar, and particularly in the borderland area between Myanmar and neighboring states, right? And in some ways, these areas are in high elevation and with denser forest coverage in comparison, let's say, with lower Burma. Lower Burma. But this relationship does not really mean that higher the mountain it gets or denser the forest it gets, there'll be more conflict, right? Obviously, there is this kind of optimal level of a place where the rebels can seek shelter, right? Which means it's unlikely, for example, for the rebels to be engaging in a military conflict in extremely high elevation or extremely dense forests, because those areas are in some ways very difficult to operate, right? So that's why we find out that the places where the conflict occur in some ways is at the mid-level of forest coverage and elevation.
Interesting. And so in these areas where you have this mid-level of coverage and a mid-level of elevation, where are these areas exactly? Because we sort of think of Myanmar as the central strip of Myanmar is reasonably low-lying, flat, lightly forested or not forested at all. And then we think of the eastern part and the western part as being quite mountainous and rugged. So where would we find these intermediate zones, and who lives there?
So in our data set, so first of all, our data set rely upon this existing conflict data set called ECLAD. So basically, it is a data set called Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, right? So it's basically a global data set that reports on daily militarized conflicts, right? So we basically subset within the Myanmar context. Now, within the Myanmar context, we can see that during this, and the time period we focused on was from 2010 to 2018. So this obviously was before, let's say, the current resistances or since the military coup. But then at that point, most of the armed conflict occurs, in the peripheral states, for example, within Rakhine State, with Shan State, Kachin State, and as well as obviously down to Kaya and the Kachin Karen State. So in some ways, that at that time, there's no reported conflicts within, let's say, the different non-ethnic regions of Myanmar.
Interesting. So it is still, when we're talking about Rakhine and we're talking about Chien, so these conflicts are still most likely to happen within the states, the predominantly ethnic minority populated states. It wouldn't come into Mandalay region or Sagaing region or Magwaya region itself. That would not be sufficiently forested. Is that what you're saying?
At that time, no. We should obviously keep in mind that the time period we looked at was 2010 to 2018, right? So during this period, obviously, there is no armed resistances within the Bamar areas of the country, right?
Yes.
So in some ways, there is this kind of, let's say, you can say it's that specific period of time. But then again, throughout Myanmar, like modern post-independent history of Myanmar, right? Most of the armed conflict also occur in those mountain regions. So in some ways, there is this, I guess, how should I say, relationship in a sense that, first of all, it is more likely for conflict to occur between, let's say, Bamar areas versus ethnic regions, right? That's basically the pattern of resistance or conflict within Myanmar for the past 70, 80 years, right? It's usually is government troops versus rebel groups, right?
Yeah.
Ethnic rebel groups. That has always been the case. Now, for Bamar areas, obviously you can talk about the Burmese Communist Party, but then even that also, the most strongholds, right, during the modern history are also located in the mountain regions, not in the central plain areas. So you can see that in general, right, the reason that is the case because central plain areas give government forces tremendous amount of advantage in their military war making, particularly if the area is flat. It's much easier for tanks, for planes to spot, those places and basically carry out conventional fighting in those regions. So it is not a coincidence. Basically, even after 1988, for example, many pro-democracy people tried to resist the military. They went to the Thai-Myanmar border regions, right, particularly in Karen State area, because it was much more mountainous and heavily forested. So there is this, I guess, this correlation. And I think that is generally fair to argue. Even today, you can say, wow, there's resistance in Sagaing region, but that's still a very small part of the country, right? Mandalay and Lower Burma are still relatively under control by the central government and Damodar.
So I find it quite interesting because I take your point very well. The Myanmar military's sort of strength against the rebel groups I would say, be summarized as sort of the 3 A's: the armor, the artillery, and the aerial assets. And yes, like all of those favor low-lying plains, and they all have problems when it comes to mountainous regions. And this is something that we've seen repeated in, for example, the conflict in Afghanistan. We've seen this repeated in insurgencies in the Caucasus region. But you say that the strongholds of the military are themselves in mountainous regions. I think Pa'an would be a good example of that. Why is it then that the military, who is so strong in plains, would still build their bases in mountainous regions?
So I think you mentioned, for example, the military try to gain strong foothold in areas that are higher in elevation or in forest areas like Pa'an and other places, right? But this is most likely a afterfact rather than before. So in the sense that, conventionally, it should not be the case because generally speaking, right, it is the lower central plain areas that is the strong foothold for the Myanmar military. But then since obviously the country and since particularly you can think about, let's say, in the 70s, 80s, and later on, and after the peace process, etc., then the central government and the military, right, gained increasingly more stronghold in previously ethnic areas, right? So you can think about major townships in those ethnic regions that probably, for example, due to let's say, peace negotiations and etc. So, like for example, Lashio, like think about Myitkyina, those kind of cities, right? These cities in some ways, are heavily under controlled by the Myanmar military. But still, right? These are artifacts rather than sort of conventional wisdom, right? Because in a sense that it is a process where the I should say the central government expanded its foothold into these regions rather than it has always been the case.
Mm. Fascinating. And so I wonder, can you speak to the results of this phenomenon when this is a country that has seen a lot of violence over, I mean, I was going to say since independence, but it's actually seen violence since before independence.
Exactly.
So there has been a perpetual level of insurgency and conflict in this country for well over a century. And you're saying that it seems to be concentrated in these specific types of areas. What type of effect does this concentration of conflict have? Is there any sort of measurable environmental impact, or is there any measurable demographic impact that is occurring? Is there some sort of buffer where animals and plants are being eradicated? Is there some sort of buffer evolving where people are simply fleeing these regions of moderate forestry and moderate elevation?
So our paper does not have anything specifically about those things. But from my understanding of it, Myanmar military or Myanmar central government has always tried to use deforestation as a way to clear out the areas that are holdouts for different ethnic armed groups historically, right? So this has been a pattern before, and which is in some way consistent with evidences from other parts of the world, right? I mean, during the Vietnam War, the Americans tried to clear out forests. Basically, then the Viet Cong have nowhere to hide. So these kind of tactics has been in use for a long time. So we can imagine that, for example, the Myanmar government understand its Myanmar central military understand that its advantage is in those sort of easily accessible regions and with transportation links. So you can imagine that at least during this period, right, and the main competence basically between the military and ethnic armed groups. So basically, if the Myanmar military was trying to eliminate those ethnic armed groups, and then what they would do is try to clear out forests, build transportation links, and essentially gain stronger foothold in those mountain and forest areas and try to eliminate those resistances. But that's a time when they had much stronger, I guess, confidence in itself. I don't know whether they are doing that right now, because right now it seems to me much more in a defensive mode than before.
So I just want to circle back and just check one thing there. So you say that they use deforestation, and you bring up the Vietnam example, which I think is very apt. But do you mean that the military itself is deforesting, or do you mean that the military government is hiring, let's say, logging contractors to disproportionately target these areas? Is this a corporate partnership, or is this just being done with firepower and chemicals?
I think it's corporate. That has been studied before in a way that during the ceasefire negotiations, government central government basically make use of this ceasefire agreement to basically inject let's say capitalist development in the borderland regions in terms of logging companies, etc.
Interesting. It's just so strange because when we look at the Vietnam example, famously we had Agent Green and Agent Orange
Right.
being dumped by the military as a chemical warfare. But here it's not even chemical warfare, it's corporate warfare, utilizing private enterprise to do something that ultimately benefits the military.
Right.
And they make money. Yeah.
But also you can, so okay, I think this is not necessarily a good comparison, right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously there is good comparison, but not necessarily a very good comparison. So the not very good comparison part would be that Myanmar military, in comparison with the Americans, are less desperate in terms of its purpose to eradicate the rebel groups. So for me, my understanding is that it's a tremendous amount of toleration, as long as it does not go over too much, right? So that's the reason why I think that's why the ethnic armed group has been in place for a very long period of time. And I think the military, in some way, tacitly tolerated that.
Mm.
So which means that they are not in desperate need to use like orange, the chemical weapons, etc., to really burn out everything, right? I think that's another one. And obviously, the other consideration is the Americans don't consider Vietnam as part of America. So which means that if they basically clear out everything and kill everyone, they don't really care. But I think Myanmar military definitely has this kind of, I don't know, this image of self. This is Myanmar, right? So which means obviously if you destroyed all the environmental, like forests and mountains, probably not going to be good for the country anyway. And also I think that is empirical evidence also has shown that the military benefits from logging companies. So which means there is this financial consideration there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to quickly touch on the actual data set that you use, because I want to make sure that we understand what do the data actually tell us and what do the data not tell us. So you're looking at a data set from 2010 to 2018.
Yes.
So this is during the Thein Sein government and part of the NLD government. Now, is it the case that you are only looking at conflict that exists between the central military and rebel groups, or are you also looking at conflicts that exist between competing rebel groups?
So the data set is basically, as I said, it's a reported militarized conflict, and we only looked at fightings between armed groups, ethnic armed groups, and the military, right? So which means we excluded conflict between different ethnic armed groups, which in some ways actually a minority. And majority of conflicts still are between rebel groups and the military. And in terms of, like, say, this kind of data and its limits, right? So first of all, this kind of quantitative studies relying upon existing data sets of conflict usually has its limits. Limits usually are because those data points are essentially reported news about what happened in a particular day, in a particular location, right? Mm-hmm. So that means there is a bias there, reportage bias, in the sense that what if there is conflict, something happened on that particular area or particular day, but there's no new news coverage of it, and then it will not be recorded, right? So that is, I think, is a common problem for most of the armed group conflicts globally, right? Because it all depends upon news coverage of them. Now, during this period, and I think, as mentioned, from Thein Sein's period to NLD period, in general, it's a relatively open period of Myanmar in a way that is better access, let's put it that way, right? It's definitely more news coverage of the country, and then it's better access by both internal media as well as international media for Myanmar. So I think that I would say, in my confidence of the reliability of the data, probably better then than now, right? So for example, today, it will be much more difficult to verify and whether things happened in a particular day, particular location, because there's not much access into the country. But during this particular period, I think those kind of access should be relatively okay.
And so you say it comes down to news reports, effectively. Does that, because ethnic minority groups, for example, we have the KIA. No, they're actually an army, but there are political wings of these groups, and these groups do post on social media. They do sort of have their own news service. It's just that they don't use major broadcasts. Would the data collection include reports by these ethnic minority organizations, political organizations, or military organizations, or would it focus on mainstream media?
So I think the data collection process, so these are not done by us. It was done by the ACLED sort of project, right? So which means, and we also used the UCDP dataset in Uppsala in Sweden as a robust check. Which means the main data used by these major international data sets, right, not collected by us, is that they claim they rely upon a variety of news accesses, and then they verify them. So I would just basically, we have to trust, and at face value at least, the reliability from those data sets.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's the sad reality of doing this kind of work that we can't have all the information that we need to have, but it is what it is. So let's then move to something that may be a little bit more difficult to speak on because it calls for conjecture. The data set, obviously, 2010 to 2018, a little bit, I don't want to call it out of date, but it is, a different time period. Now that we're looking at the post-coup conflict, the question is, what applicability does this research have to the post-coup conflict? Have you been able to keep an eye on the situation? Would you say that the overall patterns continue to be in place?
And I think during the post-coup period, I think there is some of the conflict dynamics has changed, right? So I can think of that previously, most of the conflicts were basically between the central military versus ethnic armed groups. But in the post-coup period, at least you have resistance by the Bamar majority population, which was not the case before, right? So I think that changed the dynamic a little bit. But at the same time, I think the at least from what I read of what's going on in Myanmar, that still majority of those kind of resistances still occur in areas that are not flat central plain regions, right? And many, for example, resistances, for example, they went to mountain regions for training, etc. Right? So which means that people do understand the how to say the shelter and then the coverage and then so it's kind of a logistical sort of advantages that mountain forest regions provide for resistances, for armed groups, right? This is because the dynamic of resistance still is asymmetrical in a way that even though, obviously some people are calling for, defection of the military to the PDF, etc. But then still, in terms of actual numbers, right, it's the central government still is, much bigger in size and then much better equipped, with aeroplanes and with missiles, with tanks, etc. So which means the resistance warfare, continue to be asymmetrical. So which means that if you are in an asymmetrical kind of warfare, then you need something to balance out this asymmetry. So forest coverage provide this advantage for slightly less less numbered and less equipped resistances.
Interesting, because we've seen sort of sporadic attacks that have taken place in other sort of more conventionally strongly defended places. I do remember 2021, the end of 2021, there was a pretty serious incident that occurred in Karenni State, not too far from the border. Last year, if I remember correctly, the Kachin, the KIA were holding an anniversary event in Kachin that was bombed by the military, and a large number of people died. Do incidents like this represent a major departure from the doctrine of warfare, or are these just minor sort of incidents of opportunity that were taken by the military?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think my understanding is I still think these are relatively unusual events. Right? They don't represent the major, like they say, the mode of conflict today, right? So perhaps one day the tide of balance between resistance and the military will change, and then essentially, right, you need those kind of major uprisings across the lower plains, in a way to capture the central part of Burma, right, Myanmar, right? And that's basically will be Naypyidaw and then Mandalay and the kind of regions. But before that happens, right, I think most of the conflict continue to occur in relatively better covered regions. So perhaps you can have those kind of periodic attacks, like surprise attacks, but then they tend not to hold onto those regions very long because they had the lack of logistical kind of the supply and etc. So that's why, and I think I probably would still treat them as a periodic kind of. But then, as I said, the pattern in the post-coup period in general is different from before, right? At least there are much larger resistances among the Bamar population, and then most of those Bamar population live in the lower plains. So I think that is definitely a major difference from before.
Oh, absolutely. And so, and this is kind of what I want to ask about then, is Sagaing and Magway divisions. Like a very large amount of conflict is occurring in these two divisions. Now, these two divisions are very much to the north, or in the northern part of the Bamar area. What can you say about the geography of these regions? Are they more elevated and more forested, or are they also plains regions?
So I don't know. I've never been to Magway, or I've been to Sagaing before, but my suspicion is that okay. So I'm basically talking out of comfort, and I basically making all random imaginations. But I would suppose that part of those places probably are also difficult to access. They might not necessarily have very good roads. I mean, I remember people talk about in Magway, lots of places basically have to reach by river. So that's one of my guess is basically those kind of places might be like that, or there is some kind of defection, and that basically led to one region that be much better defended in that sense. Or now, on the other hand, as I said, the Damodar is relatively probably in a more defensive mode today. So probably it did not really try to take them out. So my guess is that if they really did try to eliminate those strongholds, they probably would be able to, but they choose not to. So that probably is a reflection of the general defensive mode of military in terms of picking its fight for strategic reasons. That'll be my other guess.
I mean, that's a reasonably it's a very interesting hypothesis, and I think it's a very reasonable hypothesis as well.
Okay,
because
I'm just making random guesses, but I'm glad that you sort of agree with me on that one.
No, I do, because again, like my instinct as well would be to think of Sagaing, like, yeah, I know Sagaing is somewhat, mountainous, but not very much so.
I think obviously the parts of Sagaing close to India, right, would that be more mountainous? But I don't know where exactly those places where fightings are going on. I'm not sure. But
and like I do know though that I've seen the conflict heat maps. So most of the conflict that was happening last year was towards the south of Sagaing. So away from that. So it feels very much like the military would be able to steamroll with the tanks and the helicopters if they really dedicated. And the fact that the military's defections have historically, I say historically, since the coup, the majority of defections have come from the supporting staff of the military, logistics and quartermaster support. It makes it, I think your perspective makes sense in that context when we look at a world where you have infantry and you have the light infantry divisions, but you don't have the logistics, you don't have the trucks, you don't have the fuel, you don't have the people who can organize the mass movement of infantry from one place to another place. It would make sense that potentially the military doesn't feel confident committing a lot of resources to Magway and Sagaing when that would weaken them in other places and they wouldn't be able to react quickly. Again, I also am guessing here, I'm speaking in conjecture, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis, definitely. But I appreciate you talking outside of your comfort zone. I know for a lot of academics, it's a very uncomfortable thing to do.
I as I said, like I don't know the topography I suppose it's relatively flat regions, but also I guess they are not necessarily the most strategically important regions. So probably the military is picking its fight. You know what I'm saying? In a way that reserve its strength in areas that it considers most important, and then probably wait.
So knowledge is power, and the reason we do academia is because we want to know things so that we can apply that knowledge. Is there any sort of predictive ability? Is there anything that this research allows us to guess or to conclude about the current conflict and about the direction that the current conflict might go in the future? Is there any conclusion we can come to?
So, as I mentioned, I think, what we describe is essentially an asymmetrical warfare, right? Which means that there is this power difference between the central military versus the resistances, right? So that means that unless that power asymmetry changes, then these kind of resistances will continue to be environmentally related in a particular way, right? So my prediction would be that if we are talking about, let's say, if the goal is to have let's say, eliminate the military and then revolution and then take over the whole country, that will require to change this asymmetry of power, right? So which means that unless the resistances are becoming better equipped with tanks and aeroplanes and everything else, otherwise that will probably be very difficult.
So we are likely to see just a long-term continuation of this distribution of conflict.
Yes, and I think, obviously we don't know, but I suspect the most of the resistances and conflict in Myanmar will continue to be this low intensity but long-term kind of resistance that has been characterized for the country for quite a long period of time.
Fascinating. So
obviously that's the sad part, right? But then again,
it's the conclusion that we can come to. So I want to thank you very much for coming on and talking about this topic. By sort of tradition, we always want to end giving the guests the opportunity to share some insight or some thoughts with the audience that you want people to to leave this interview thinking about or considering as they go on about their day and go on about their lives. So I'd like to invite you just to share some final thoughts and some final words.
Okay, so and I would say, I've been studying Myanmar for the past 10 years, and I think obviously many scholars have worked on the country, but then our study is one of the few that they use quantitative methods. So that I think I'm confident to say that this is one of the few studies use data sets and a quantitative method to study the country. Now that in terms of methodology, obviously there is not really one is better than the other, right? But then they provide different perspectives, and I would say, right, in a way that quantitative data sets tend to have a much more macro views of things, and then qualitative views research are more specific in a particular location, and then tend to have more richer and more nuanced understandings of what's going on in the country. And I think one of the takeout obviously would be that today access to the country will become is very difficult, and I think people will need to have a sense of what type of methodology we can use to continue to study what's going on within Myanmar without this access, right? And I think that is potentially the challenge, but also I would say these days there are more globalized quantitative data sets people can have access to, right? I mean, there are increasingly more, like say satellite data, and so like lots of like GIS information systems that are providing those kind of data, right? So but that require a new set of methodology or knowledge to use the data sets, right? So that means I think that is perhaps the future, in a way that there are more data, right? But then those data might not necessarily be easily accessible in a conventional sort of quantitative historical field research type of way, right? They are much more macro and also quantitative and computerized. So I think that is and I would say there are opportunities in terms of studying the country from afar.
Since the coup, Better Burma has provided consistent humanitarian aid to vulnerable communities across Myanmar. Over time, however, we have also come to realize that another consequence of the coup is a severely collapsed economy. Trade and tourism have almost entirely evaporated, and local artisan communities suddenly found every opportunity of continuing livelihood closed off to them. To help support those artisan communities, Better Burma now brings items direct from their workshop into your home. These lovely pieces from a far corner of the world will not only light up your room or make a lovely gift for a loved one, but they'll also help dozens of artisans create sustainable businesses and livelihoods. Part of each purchase will also go towards our ongoing nonprofit mission. To see these beautiful crafts, visit alokacrafts.com. That's Aloka, A-L-O-K-A, crafts, C-R-A-F-T-S, one word, alokacrafts.com. Of course, as is your preference, you can also consider making a donation through our normal channels. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam